There we go. You may have to redo that because I looked up in the corner and didn't see it recording.
Okay, let's try that again. Let's try that again. I'm sorry.
Take
I
two.
apologize. All right, take two. All right. So for everyone who missed the part where I gave the introduction about Dr. Cobb, because I wasn't recording. And so here we go. We're going to start this introduction again. Uh, Here with me is Dr. Adam Cobb. He's from Dr. Elaine's Soil Food Web School. Dr. Cobb's passion for agriculture emerged during his several months of volunteer work on organic farms in New Zealand. Uh, his time in graduate school cultivated a broad vision for the restoration of living soils, as well as the power of research and community engagement to address global food production. We definitely want to talk about that.
Mhm.
Some of the challenges that we're having with global food production. He's joined the Soul Food Web School. He joined the Soul Food Web School in 2021, following his dream to help regenerate soils, which a lot of our gardeners and farmers may want to know about today.
Mhm.
Uh, Improve human nutrition. And I definitely want to talk about human nutrition because we're definitely not getting much of that because,
Mhm.
we're just at an all-time high at being just ill, especially here in the United States. Uh, and heal our planet, which is global warming, which I know some people doesn't believe exists.
Yeah, we'll try to broaden that from global warming to global environmental challenges.
Absolutely. Dr. Cobb, can you tell us a little bit what it is that you do at the Dr. Elaine's Soul Food School?
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Donnie. So I've been here, we're closing in on 3 years now, and the role that has developed for me is primarily what I would call science communication. So I work both with our internal community of students, of which there are around 3 or 4 thousand, as well as our external community people who check on our YouTube channel, look at our blogs, try to connect with the school's knowledge base, um, to help people. I would say like level up is the goal, is my goal, is anytime I'm with anybody in any situation, giving a public talk or speaking one-on-one, I'm trying to say, okay, here is over the last 15 years, the way that I've developed a conceptual framework, a way of viewing how this all connects, because soil is so complex. And and while I've put in the time, uh, I know so little, Donnie. I think even my heroes in the movement will say all of humans understand about 5% of the story of soils, and I know way less than 5% personally, but it's exciting. It gets me out of bed every morning. It gets me meeting people and networking and even traveling around the world some just to share this passion for the to celebrate the amazing things that the rest of life on Earth are doing that we can be guardians and custodians with.
Absolutely, that's good. That's great. And so, when we're talking about regenerating the soil, uh, how do we even know that our soil is deficient?
Mm, this is an excellent question. um, I came out of the agricultural university training pathway, all right, and what I saw as a default over there was nutrients. You assess all the nutrients in the soil. You get this snapshot. You spend money on soil tests and maybe pH and a few other, kind of chemical factors, right? The and I really have come to say that's not the driver of a healthy soil ecosystem. The driver is the life in the soil, the microorganisms, especially the ones that partner with the plants to make sure that the plants are healthy, and then all of the other forms of life that have come into a sort of dynamic balance with each other. So earthworms and there's different microarthropods that shred organic matter so that the oxygen can get in and that the bacteria and fungi can work on it. And so that's the way that we know that our soil ecosystem is thriving is if it's bursting with life. It's bursting with life, not just the things that we plant and harvest, but the essential workforce, as Dee Dee Purshouse calls them. The essential workforce is the kind that we typically need a microscope to assess. And when the soil is teeming with those organisms, it tends to be very functional. And when we see those organisms be like less abundant and less diversity, less unique species of those soil organisms, then we're watching a soil ecosystem that's degrading over time.
Yeah. So, Dr. Cobb, I'm a little like you. I know a little, and I don't know a lot. I would probably say I probably know not a lot. And one of the ways that I could tell, well, I think that um, I have good soil, and we're going to dumb this down a little bit for our followers. Some of these are gardeners.
Mm-hmm.
If I see lots of weeds, I say, okay, I have good soil.
Mm-hmm.
But my main indicator that I have good soil um, is if I see mushrooms growing in my grass or growing in my mulch.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think that that's a fungi. Um, how does fungi affect the soil? And there's lots of weeds. Is that an indicator of good soil or bad soil?
Mm. Yeah, so one of the things that I have really picked up from working with Elaine these last 2.5 years is that soil, like all ecosystems, changes over time. And a lot of times, what I would call a weed, I would say, is pretty early in the life of a recovering soil. So, yes, when you have bare ground and you don't have weeds and things, that's more like dirt. There's probably not a lot of organisms happy and living in there. And many of those weeds are the species that come in early in this process and start filling that soil with sugars that they leak out of their root systems, decomposing organic matter. They start shifting, they find a few bacteria and say, let's partner up here. They get into a relationship, and those bacteria make the environment better. But what we want to see is that we push through. You mentioned fungi. Those tend to be later in the recovery of the ecosystem that you get a soil that's kind of dominated by the fungi in there. The bacteria they're still very important, but they take a little bit of a back seat in that process. And we see that while some plants that people don't want in their garden could become more numerous later, a lot of those early weedy species, those things that reproduce quickly and make tons of seeds and seem a little pesky to us humans, they kind of naturally go away. Not maybe not entirely, but it's like turning down the volume on those, especially if we are practicing really good soil management techniques like not tilling the soil very often or at all, covering the soil surface with mulch, or having plants growing at all times so that we're rotating from cooler season to warmer season plants in our garden or land. All of that will kind of naturally over time develop a more stable ecosystem. And so you'll have fewer weeds and fewer disease causing organisms as the organisms that partner with the plants that we want to grow become more kind of in control of their environment, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And we're constantly changing and we're constantly learning about our environment, about our ecosystem. I know as a child, one of those pesky weeds was dandelions.
Mm,
And now, we're putting them in the capsule and we're using them for the health benefits.
Mhm.
And so some things have changed. But I visited a farm probably about 2 weeks ago, and I got a very good look at the no-till system.
Mhm.
And guys like me who've been trained and from other folks is kind of like passed down from generation to generation. So I really don't have like a formal training.
Mhm.
I actually have a Juris Doctorate. But
Mhm.
it's kind of like far away from here. This guy does his farming, but he has a JD. But I'm used to tilling, and
Mhm.
so as I when I went to visit the farm, um, one of the farmers was telling me that tilling actually was bad for his crops, excuse me, because as he turned over the dirt, he was activating lots of weed seeds. He said it was like a
Mhm.
hundred and something weed seeds that he was activating.
Yep.
Uh, and so what he did was is that he started putting compost on top of the compost and in the between the rows. I know it's another scientific name for it, but I call it rows. We're going to dumb it down for my followers. In between the rows, he was putting mulch for you to
Mhm.
walk through, and the mulch would actually keep the weeds down,
Yep.
and the weeds in between, let's say um, I was just going to call it the hill, so
Mhm.
my father to understand. The weeds that was there, he would, pick them up, and the only weeds that he said that he would have is pretty much like the tomato plants who didn't burn up during the compost system.
Mhm.
And so this no-till system, could you explain a little bit the difference between soil and dirt?
Soil and dirt. Okay, this is a great question. So I would call dirt, there's the minerals there. There's the sand, the silt, the clay, rocks and pebbles. Um, but when you would look under a microscope at some of that material, you would probably just see a few bacteria hanging out and not a lot of, fungi make these nice little, we call them filaments, little threads, and they're really easy to spot especially certain fungi are really easy to spot. And then you see protozoa, which look like little tiny animals, single-celled animals going around. They're like the predators in the system. They're eating the bacteria and fungi. And then there's these really cool organisms called nematodes that are like teeny tiny worms, and you can tell from their mouths and other things in their anatomy what they eat a lot of times, or generally what they eat maybe 80% of the time. So you'll actually see a nematode with a little spear in its mouth if it's a specialist in eating fungi, because it'll pierce the fungi with that spear, and it's like a straw that it sucks the juices out of the fungal organism. So we can tell so much if we have these different kinds of life there in the soil. Um, Plus, you can turn over a shovel and say, "Oh, how many earthworms do I see? Do I see some mites and other things going around here?" They're all doing something. So you have to have life, in my opinion, to have soil. And as a consequence of having life, but also as the foundation for life, you have to have lots of organic matter in the soil. These might be old dead roots, decomposing leaves, anything that was once alive and is now dead and is decomposing in the soil. And you really need to see 2, 3, 4, 5% of that top layer of soil being formerly living material that is decomposing before you're going to have the nutrient cycle working the right way, before you're going to have the houses and the food for the organisms. It all comes back to that organic matter. So to me, dirt is like just the minerals. It's like the stuff that would stick to the bottom of your shoes, but soil is life and the things that help life to sustain itself, like the organic material and the minerals. And I would probably also add for the most part, you need to see living plants in that system for it to be soil. The plants are the source of energy for the ecosystem. They're solar panels, they're collecting the energy from the sun and turning it into sugars. And without them pumping those sugars down into the soil, you don't have the life.
So is it safe to say that those pesky slugs mean that you have soil and not dirt?
Slugs can be a good indicator of that. They can, but I also want to see the things in the soil that help control the slugs, right? If you look in a natural ecosystem, thing I don't like the word balance because it sounds static, but things are in a dynamic kind of balance or equilibrium, right? The population of slugs goes up a little bit, then the populations of stuff that um, eat slugs goes up a little bit and pushes the population of slugs back down. And so there's like this natural up and down cycle to a lot of organisms out there in the natural world. And we can have that in our gardens. This is one of the reasons I plant alyssum and certain other flowers to draw in beneficial insects that can help eat aphids or other things before they become a huge problem.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna take my glasses back off, see the reflection. You said aphids, and so um, we plant like marigolds, like different flowers.
Mhm,
Listen, marigolds.
mhm.
That's supposed to be a good deterrent. Are there any other plants that they should be planting to get rid of aphids?
Ooh, it really depends on where you are. So even here in the US, there's six different what are called bioregions,
Okay.
where maybe like a natural feature like the Rocky Mountains kind of changed what's to the left versus the right, right? So most of the coastal western like area of the US is in one bioregion, and the sort of plants and microorganisms and insects that you would want to partner with over there will be very different than if you go over the mountains because they were separated for so long, right? By that. And there's a great website. It's called One Earth. That you can type in like One Earth bioregions and see these maps. And I really encourage people to be as local as possible with what they're using. Now, wheat, as far as I understand, comes from Turkey in its origin. And so there's no problem with planting wheat because it doesn't escape the human interaction. It doesn't get out of control typically. But there are other plants like kudzu in the American Southeast that have escaped and become a huge problem. So I would really encourage people to work bioregionally or even in a smaller set. There's a term called an ecoregion that says what the land that you're on, what was it historically? Why not work with those species as much as possible? They're adapted for that local, back thousands and thousands of years. Why not tap into what the indigenous people of that region understood as the way to cultivate the land or work with the land?
Okay. That's so when you say these regional places, are you referring to like, Michigan, we're here, like we're in zone 5B.
Mm.
Is that what you're referring to, or are you referring to something different?
It's a little different. So you're probably mentioning the USDA hardiness map that kind
Yes.
of tells you more from temperature than anything else what you can grow there crop wise. And I'm not really talking about typical garden plants either, like go nuts with cucumbers, tomatoes, anywhere that they'll grow, right? There are like safe from that escape of from the garden. They're not probably going to become a pest in the local ecosystems. But people have moved like grass species that are from Eurasia here into North America, and they often disrupt the local grasslands. And vice versa. We have some plants here from North America that have been taken to Europe that have escaped and become invasive. And so I always caution people, really understand this. In many places, the universities around you, there might be a native plant society around you. There's ways to access information about specific to your place. Like if it's Michigan, then there's going to be a rich history going back to the indigenous peoples of Michigan of what things did really well and what things don't necessarily belong
Yeah,
in that area. Yeah.
that was interesting because um, I stay in the city of Detroit, and my uncle stays in the suburbs. Probably, it's probably like 15 minutes away. He stays in Southfield, and he sees Japanese beetles all the time.
Hmm.
I never see them. And I'm always curious as to why he sees so many Japanese beetles, and I never see them. And I see slugs, but I don't see
Hmm.
Japanese beetles.
That's very interesting. It makes me wonder if there's a possibility that someone around you is trapping a lot of the local population, because I know there are some pheromone traps that work pretty well on those, um, or something maybe eating them, keeping their
Yeah,
population under check, that is not very active where he is. So yeah, that's an interesting one, and we do see that. We see patterns of, here's where the pests move through, and they to the north and the south they aren't a problem, but right here they are,
yeah,
and it's a we have infinite questions about this, right?
right. Absolutely. I call it pocketing. You see these pockets where, you might see one insect, but the other pocket of this area isn't affected by that pocket.
Hmm.
Um, I guess I never really dug in deep, but to hear you talk
Hmm.
kind of made me think like, you know what, maybe I should look into that a little bit more and see why is it or what animal or insect is, you know, causing him to have Japanese beetles and
Hmm.
for me to be, not having.
Well, in your slug, um, there are certain nematodes that live in the soil that can infect slugs and reduce their population. Um, of course, people have found, yeah, I've talked to a lot of people who say, oh, this always works for me and slugs in my garden. And then the next person says, I tried that, it didn't work over here. And there's no one size fits all solution. Maybe different species of slug, maybe just different environmental conditions, right? Even some people, I'm a huge fan of mulch, as I mentioned, but some people have said, oh, mulch is a great place for the slugs to hide and reproduce and then come out of it to eat my plants. And so I go, well, maybe we need different kinds of mulch or
Right.
a different style of that. But could I mention with insects, I do have like one nearly universal help for insects in the garden.
Okay. Please.
Healthy plants can produce a response to being nibbled on. They can make chemicals that don't taste very good, right? To the insects. A lot of people know, for example, that the leaves of tomato are not good for humans to eat, right?
Right.
They can be early in the season, maybe relatively more tasty to insects, and as they're nibbled on a little bit, they we call it upregulate. They put more of a priority on making these defensive chemicals. But if they're not well nourished, which is through the soil, and if they're not living in like a kind of a community with all these other microorganisms and things, it's sort of like a human whose immune system isn't working very well. They're going to get sick a lot. And I, even last year with my tomatoes, later in the season, I started noticing these deficiencies in them. And I ended up, through research, saying I think it was silica deficiency. So I've added more sand and um, pebbles and things to the bottom of my container garden this year so that they can find the silica that they need. And there's just a bunch of minerals that the plants have to have in order to be able to fight off pests, um, diseases, and and the best way for us to ensure that those nutrient cycles are working is to make sure that the system is full of life, full of those microorganisms, because they hold and retain and cycle all the nutrients that plants need during their lives.
Awesome. And you're absolutely right because I get DM messages all the time. This worked, or this didn't work. Because I often give people advice about some of the things that I've done that has worked for me, and it hasn't worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes if they DM me, I'll tell them some things to do to kind of tweak it because they're just it's just different places just calls for different solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you talked about decomposing, and I wanted to get into that segue, but it's just so much stuff that I want to cover. But let's get right into it now. Composting.
Mm.
And I've heard so I compost differently. I compost over the winter. When I clean my garden out, I get my leaves and my grass and I compost. And over the winter, I throw my food scraps
Mm-hmm.
into my compost bin. Let's say probably by mid-May, most of it's ready,
Mm-hmm.
to spread around. Um, A, I've heard that compost really isn't dirt. Well, you've confirmed.
Mm-hmm.
Then I've heard that compost really isn't soil.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a great topic. So compost is one of the pillars that we teach at the Soil Food Web School because, well, I would say let me take a step back there. Compost as part of is part of the pillar that I would call biological amendments, right? There's many different styles. We focus on aerobic compost, so where you have sufficient oxygen in, in the compost pile at all times that it really ignites quite a bit of heat at the center, right? It facilitates organisms that they need oxygen to breathe and to do their life processes. So they get more and more active and they make heat, like, you know, maybe a perfect target. Where I targeted my pile was at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 60 Celsius. Now, the whole pile is not that hot. It's sort of like a basketball at the middle or some kind of odd shaped hot center. And so we want to give that hot center enough time. It can knock back anything that could be damaging to our plants, the diseases and things that could come along with those organic materials. And there's research to suggest, yeah, that if you hold the heat um, for a few days, that it sets the stage where like anything that could potentially hurt your plant, not anything, but most things that could hurt your plants or you or animals will be beat up by that heat. And
Right.
then we turn the pile. We do this 2 or 3 times till we get all material going through a hot cycle. And then we've set the stage. Now what's left in the pile, we've sort of selected, filtered out the things we don't want, set the stage tilted towards the things that really will partner with our plants: bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, as I mentioned earlier. And then we have to let that mature. And personally, after it matures and cools, I keep it for a long time because then the fungi and other things continue to grow and expand. And you see new bugs and things show up in the pile. And I put composting worms in it after a while. And they are really good to further help. They create little tunnels so the air can move through and you keep the pile properly moist. It's like, it's kind of like cooking a really good pizza, right? It's a craft. Yeah. Yeah.
So, how important is it to keep to turn your compost and to keep it wet? And
Mm,
here's here. And after you answer that question, go ahead, and then I'll go into the other question.
Well, as you mentioned, I also like to compost over winter. If I can get through the hot part of my composting in the fall, I prefer that because then I'm not out there in the snow turning my pile. But the reason that we turn is one, to get all the material through the thermophilic phase, right? That, find that it's a sweet spot. It's like Goldilocks, right? Not too hot, not too cold. Um, and then the other thing is that we turn it to reintroduce oxygen and to monitor the moisture. It can dry out, like in different ways. And so when we turn it, we can squeeze it in our hands. And I like to see the moisture being what we call around 50%. So if I took a nice handful of that material and squeezed it, I'd have a few drops pooling at the edges of my fingers, but maybe not a stream of water coming out of my hand. And so you just kind of get the feel for, this is in the Goldilocks zone. This is in the sweet spot. Not too dry, not too wet. And it's like I said, every compost pile, the materials are a little different. The climate is a little different. You have to learn how to respond to that. But if we can create these ideal conditions, then instead of just getting some organic material with a few nutrients at the end, we can get a source of inoculum. Whereas we use it in our garden, we're actually seeding in more life. And those microorganisms make compounds that signal to plants, you know, the environment's good, you can grow bigger here. Well, here's the zinc that you were looking for. We brought it to you. Now you can have more efficient photosynthesis, right? The health of the plant so that it can make more sugars to share. It's a completely um, mutually beneficial kind of relationship. And the compost just becomes a tool. There are many, but it becomes a tool to get the life back online. Because in a lot of our soils, we, through use of herbicides, fertilizers, tillage, all these things have really knocked the life out or back severely.
So here's an interesting thing that about compost. Um, there's basically three elements. You need water,
Mhm,
air, and I'm
mhm.
just going to say fire because it's heat. And I've
Yeah,
actually seen some compost fire, some compost is like just catching fire because they were just dry
yeah.
from the grass. And so I just don't understand because how that's all working. And even though I compost, I still don't understand the science behind it. It's like water cools down, like water and fire doesn't meet, water and heat doesn't mix. And so what is happening in this compost bin with the water, the
Hmm.
balance between the water and the heat? And you, like you say, you've gotten up to 104 degrees.
Hmm.
What does the water do when you pour water on something that's up to 104? Would you say 104 or 140?
140.
Yeah,
140.
140.
Hmm. Yeah, I actually had an issue because it was so cold out when I was turning my pile this year. I had to add some water and it cooled the pile way more than I wanted to. And it took me extra time because it's the organisms that are driving the heat. So it's the bacteria mostly in the early phases of composting. Later on, when the pile is done heating and all that, the fungi become a bigger component of what's active. But those bacteria, like us, they need to drink, they need to eat, they need to breathe, they need shelter, right, from harsh elements. And so you kind of have to think about babying your compost pile, wrapping it up in a tarp, maybe making sure that extra water doesn't come in through rain or snow. Um, I got these construction pallets. I found them, treated them with linseed oil so they wouldn't rot too quickly, and then I put a mesh on them so that it would lift my pile just a few inches off the ground, and then air could come in from the bottom into the pile. So I'm just trying to create the perfect conditions for these happy little bacteria. and then they're reproducing and eating and breathing and generating heat in the pile. But if they don't have enough water, then they're shutting down, right? Rather than ramping up their activity. If they don't have enough food, different kinds of food. I like to bring together, dried grass clippings, and I even put a little cracked corn into my compost pile this year. That was some old chicken feed and leaves from the trees. And if you have someone come through to trim your branches on your trees, that's a great resource if you can chop the branches up, right? Because you're putting all these different kinds of foods together, and then the more diversity of inputs, usually the more organisms that you see, the more different species of organism.
Absolutely. And so I hear a lot about the greens and the browns, which is the
Mm-hmm.
greens is your grass, your browns are your leaves, and then
Mm-hmm.
we have the food scrappies. Now, I've always been told to not put certain foods in your compost bin, such as onions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've heard conflicting stories about lemons.
Yeah.
And recently, I've heard that you can actually put like chicken bones and chicken. I and so I'm starting to hear now you can put living organisms. I've never put meat, any type of
Mm-hmm.
meat, into my compost bin. So I'm just amazed when I hear, okay, that there's nutrients in the bones of
Yeah.
chicken that breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the fatty meat? There's nutrients in the actual meat that we consume that actually adds to the nutrition in the compost.
Yeah, when you get into animal products, it can be tricky. And I don't typically suggest people use a large proportion of those things. There are other systems like you may have heard of bokashi, which is sort of a fermentation composting process. I tend to put all kitchen scraps there. And when I make a compost pile, I'll actually make about a little over half of that material I try to get just as leaves and wood chips. So they have a lot of carbon. Lots because those will really help feed the fungi, right? Fungi are slower to digest things, but they're better at digesting really complex organic materials than bacteria typically are. So I use a lot of that. You could theoretically call those browns, right? A high, we talk about a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when I say a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, they maybe have 60 or 100 carbon molecules for every one nitrogen. So 100 to 1 or 60 to 1. And then I'll usually make a third of my pile what I would call green material that is maybe cut grass that was dried. Um, there is some people I use a lot of coffee grounds and eggshells and things. Like I try to get a lot of these materials that their their carbon to nitrogen ratio might be more like 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, and those can sustain the heat of the pile a lot better. And then I will spike the pile with a high nitrogen source typically. I've used blood meal before, which is something that you can purchase that's an organic input, high source of nitrogen. I mentioned the cracked corn. We often in the group look for cracked corn as a really good way to get the heat of the pile up because of its high nitrogen content. Um, there's all kinds of things that you can Google about inputs and compost. You can find little calculators. uh at the end of the day, in totality, when you mix all the materials in your pile and you want to mix them really well, um you're probably looking at about 25 to 35 carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be that sweet spot where it'll really ramp up the bacteria, get that heat going. If you have enough air and enough water in the pile all together, you're just creating the perfect environment for the organisms that we want and setting back any organisms that we don't want.
And so nitrogen, um, my followers, I know they want to know what nitrogen is. Would you say that chicken poop is nitrogen, manure is nitrogen? Are those the sources of nitrogen?
Yeah, mostly nitrogen from organic materials is going to come from things that are proteins. So we see a lot of nitrogen, for example, if people get access to some alfalfa hay, has a lot of nitrogen in it. The corn does, things with um, a higher protein content in them. So grasses don't have that much protein typically, but legumes like the peas or beans, they will. Now, if you let those things go all the way to where they're making peas and beans, they start putting the protein in the seed.
Okay.
And it's different than if you were to cut it green before it's really reproducing. And then all that protein is in the leaves and the stems of the plant. So, yeah, high protein is really, really important. Elaine calls it party food, right? You got to have some party food there to really get those microorganisms bumping.
Awesome, awesome. So is it a good idea to keep your compost bin in the same place, or should you be rotating it?
Hmm. I think it's less important the place. You need to find a place where you can moderate extremes. So, I don't put my compost in this hot sun or in a place where we'll get a drench of water off the roof or something, right? Um, but it's actually the best thing you can do is you can take some of that really high quality matured compost from your last pile and inoculate your new piles with it, or even mix it with a little water, right? When you're building your new pile and get because it'll be full of the spores and the dormant states of different organisms. They'll be already reproducing. Over time, we tend to see the diversity go up in these piles as people make one. They're like, okay, I did okay. And then in the second one, because they're building it with a little material from the first one, it's like a sourdough starter and it gets their pile faster to that kind of diversity. And some of these organisms, they'll come in unexpectedly. They'll come in inside the guts of a bug that comes to eat some of your compost. And then as it drops waste in your pile, now you've got some new bacteria in there. Now you got some new fungi in there.
Okay. I had a friend who had a compost pile, and weeds started growing out of
Mm,
it. And so, I asked him. I said, "Hey, were you using, those weed trees and throwing your weeds inside your compost bin?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "But it should have gotten hot enough to burn the weeds up."
yeah.
Uh, so, because you're saying that you see life, so my question is, can you use weeds in your compost bin? Is that recommended?
Mm. I do try to avoid putting seeds in my compost pile. If I take the weed plant pulled out or whatever, and it's already started making seeds, I might discard those somewhere else. But your friend is right. If the compost gets hot enough for long enough, it will kind of neutralize a lot of those seeds. And a lot of weedy plants, the things that we would call weeds, have very tiny seeds. So there's not a lot of, protection there from the heat. But you have to move everything long enough. Usually, say you were at 135 or 140 Fahrenheit. Usually you're talking about 2 or 3 days that it needs to maintain that temperature in the center. And then if you turn the pile and your center doesn't get hot enough, now there's just a little material where the seeds might still be viable, right? So you gotta we try to get everybody through at least 3 turns. Um, that's build the pile, turn once. Now the second set of material is in the center. get it hot enough, turn again, and then hopefully at that point you've balanced it all out and it's going to start cooling off. Now all the material has been heated. Now you don't want excessive heat, but you have to keep monitoring it. You can buy these big composting thermometers, and I want to see that that pile just that the heat in it gradually goes down and down and down until it matches the environment. But you have to get everything hot enough for long enough to kill those seeds.
I was at a, I visited quite a few farms, and one of the farmers told me he couldn't plant uh, in one area of his farm, and he said that they would have these ground fires. He gave me the scientific name for it. I'm sorry, I don't, I don't
Hmm.
know it. But this particular area in his farm, he said the soil was so full of nitrogen that it would just catch on fire. And he would, he had to keep monitoring it. He'd have to call the fire department to come. He said the fire department would just put tons and tons of water on it and
Hmm.
just flame back up.
Hmm.
Um, so that's why actually should you be moving your compost pile? Because I'm thinking like, is that because of there's so much nitrogen going into the ground creating these
Hmm.
ground fires?
Yeah, that must be a really uniquely high load of nitrogen. Um, in our compost piles, the nitrogen is more balanced with the carbon.
Okay.
And so you don't tend to see that issue. It's the same thing like some people will put uncomposted, pretty fresh chicken manure on plants in their garden, and then they'll find that their plants die. And it's probably from the toxic amount of nitrogen in there. Where if they mixed it with the right materials, bedding, straw, other things, they could get that concentration to a safe level. Although I never use uncomposted chicken manure because of some of the diseases that they carry and all. I want it to really have matured. Um, but I've raised rabbits before, and rabbit manure can go straight on a garden because the carbon and nitrogen are more balanced in the rabbit manure. And so you
Oh,
don't see that burning of the plants. Um, it seems to me that your friend might want to get a bunch of wood chips out on that part of their land or something to put some carbon there that helps it helps the nitrogen be drawn into the organisms that are eating the wood chips, and then it's less of a problem in the environment typically.
so, and I'm glad you said that about rabbits because my sister have a rabbit, and
Mhm.
she loves her flowers. She's always playing in her flower beds, and this rabbit is about the size of, I would say, a poodle. It's a huge rabbit. It's like this overweight rabbit. What are you feeding this thing? So I'm pretty sure she's going to be using some of that rabbit poop to put in her flowers to actually bring some better life to the flowers. Um, and so we're going to segue into talking about AM fungi.
Aha, my favorite.
So, what is AM fungi? Where can you find it? Can you reproduce it? Let's get into it.
Yeah, so AM stands for arbuscular mycorrhizal, and this is one of the most common partnerships in the natural world. Something like 80% of the plants on Earth, that's hundreds, two, 300,000 species, right? Would be 80%. I don't even know if we have figured out all the species of plant. We definitely have not figured out all the species of fungi. So, but it's a lot of them, is the vast majority. They will form this relationship. And so this kind of fungi, there's different species of mycorrhizal fungi. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. There's lots of them. And in certain conditions, they've been depleted. I've seen this, tillage is actually something that knocks the AM fungi back really harshly. So think about the long tubes that I mentioned or threads of that's how the fungi grow. If you get something in there that slices and dices that, then they bleed to death. right? They just, all the stuff leaks out of them and they're gone. So tillage can be very devastating. But AM fungi they're everywhere. There's lots of them. They're diverse. They partner with the majority of plants and they help plants absorb more nutrients from soil, especially phosphorus, calcium, zinc. They help them take up water from the soil. And so you can almost think of it like a way of taking the root system of the plant, which might be like my finger here, and then adding these extra little um, uh, extensions to the root system. So then it can contact more soil, it can absorb more nutrients, it can absorb more water. And I would call AM fungi like the one of the top examples we have where it's almost always highly beneficial to both partners. The fungi need the plant to get food. The plant's sharing food with the fungi. There's a direct connection in the root system. The fungi actually go into the roots a little bit, not as an invader, as an ally,
Okay.
and they share resources with each other and both benefit.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so AM fungi is everywhere, you say.
Mm-hmm.
It's located in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're segueing into this this new form of gardening. And I wouldn't say it's a new form of gardening or growing.
Mm-hmm.
Probably we just haven't we've expanded upon it. Hydroponics
Mm.
is AM fungi in hydroponics, and what is we want to talk about hydroponics versus soil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hydroponics is interesting. For certain plants, especially I'm thinking about some of the like lettuces and greens and such that make their living in soils which are more highly disturbed, typically. Like if you think about brassicas, uh, like um, like the cabbage groups, right? There's a bunch of different brassicas we love to eat. They if there's an area of soil that's gotten like messed up by animals or has started to erode or whatever, there's less competition with a lot of plants, and that's where the brassica family loves to go, right? And sunflowers, there's a bunch of other examples of this where it's like if you disturb the soil, then you just get them there, right? Like you mentioned, your buddy said, tilling will wake up some of those seeds.
Yes.
They like those conditions. Those are the things that seem really to like hydroponics as well, because you're kind of giving them an I in many ways an ideal scenario in terms of nutrients and all of that, but they're plants that are making their living in something that's not really like a healthy soil, right? It's a it's more like dirt plus nutrients, right? And I think hydroponics is great for certain things. For certain things, I wouldn't expect a lot of fungi. Maybe some yeasts. Uh, it would be the fungi I'd expect to be active in hydroponic systems. There'd be beneficial bacteria, maybe some protozoa, but it's really hard to dissolve enough oxygen into water, right? You constantly have to be adding that flow of air into that system. And the hotter it gets, the harder it is to get the oxygen dissolved into the water. Um, so hydroponics can be great, but they're more about nutrients and water than they are about microorganisms. Now, some people have really been experimenting with how do you get the good microbes into those systems. It's very exciting, but microorganisms tend to make like glues and sticky biofilms and things. And so people often are like, well, now all my pipes are jammed up with crud in these systems. So, yeah.
So I'm doing an experiment right now um, with hydroponics. I'm trying to see if I can grow
Hmm.
some crops in a water bottle, uh, put some hydroponic nutrient foods in the bottle.
Hmm.
One thing that I'm not getting that I learned from aquaponics, my koi pond, is
Hmm.
that water has to move
Right.
to create, oxygen and air.
Hmm.
Um, and so with growing in water bottom, you can get the nutrients. You may not be able to get the AM fungi or unless it's in the nutrients. But the movement, there's no water pump on there to pump the water to make it move. And so oxygen is very important
Hmm.
to hydroponics. So the water has to be flowing, it has to be moving in order to give the plants. So plants need oxygen just like humans.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Plants, we would call them obligate aerobes. They need oxygen to respire and to do their cellular processes. Um, have you ever seen a bald cypress tree?
Yeah,
Yeah, so they grow like near swamps and stuff a lot of times. They'll make those tall structures, we call them cypress knees, that
yes,
grow out of the ground. That's actually the tree trying to get more air down into its root system, right?
yeah,
That's a structure that helps it to keep its root system aerobic, even though it's in a swamp.
yeah. I
Mm.
just saw that last year. I was in the swamps in Louisiana, in the
Hmm.
New Orleans. I don't know if it's actually the city of New Orleans, but I went on a swamp tour, and it was interesting because the people that I think the swamp people that live off the swamp, it's real. I thought that was just like,
It's real.
yeah, it's a real thing.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I saw that tree there just recently.
They're really cool. They're one of my favorites. And there's a lot of different mechanisms, but I mean, even with your house plants, like if I overwater that ficus behind me,
Okay.
it will die eventually. It will run out of oxygen if I keep the soil saturated, and it will get diseases and other things, right? And so I actually tend to run my house plants where they're on the edge of being too thirsty all the time. I really let them dry out.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're not the first person that I've heard say that as well. I know I'm growing a banana plant. I have one outside and one in the house. And the one in the house actually does better because I water it less.
Hmm.
As you know, banana plants will produce more banana plants. And,
Hmm.
and this one was dry. And I just saw another one popping up alongside of the. So yeah, you're not the only one. Let's get
Hmm.
into nutrition. Uh,
Hmm.
and so the soil has an effect on our nutrition. I'm 90% vegan. I will
Hmm.
eat a little bit of meat every now and then, but most of my diet is you know vegan.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I'm curious to know is the fruits and vegetables that I'm eating, am I getting enough nutrients from
Hmm.
my fruits and vegetables? Because there's a lot of overweight vegans out here. Believe me, I'm not a small guy myself. Yeah.
Yeah, I just went through winter, so I've been cultivating a little extra weight myself. Um, okay, so globally, if we look at patterns of human nutrition, and I got to study with this amazing professor of human nutrition because I brought that element into my research. I said, I don't just care about the production of these plants I'm growing. I want to know how nutritious the food is, right? So I learned that globally, um, quality protein can be a huge issue. And I've raised laying hens before. I'm a huge fan of if I could give every human child on this planet access to 2 eggs a day, I would because of all the protein in there. There's other vitamins and nutrients and such, but that would be one of the huge things. A lot of people are also iron and zinc deficient, and you can get iron and zinc from a plant-based diet. You can get protein from a plant-based diet. You just have to be um, intentional. Diet diversity is important. Getting those legumes in there, getting nuts, those kind of things in there, right? You can do it. I have several friends that are 100% vegan. Um, One thing that gets a little tricky with a plant-based diet is there's lots of fiber in that diet typically. And a lot of fiber in the diet can actually reduce what we absorb as the food is moving through our system. But maybe a bigger thing is what's our gut microbiome? What are the organisms in there? Because they can help digest food for us. And a lot of us have a very disturbed gut microbiome. If we look at humans that are doing like hunter-gatherer lifestyles and all, they have this diverse and abundant bacteria and things colonizing their whole system and helping them to absorb nutrients. And many of us in a with a modern lifestyle, the kinds of foods we eat, the way we eat, even how even our childhood like context, we can end up having things missing. I have a buddy in med school right now. He just got a paper out about how to help people fix their gut microbiome with you may have heard, it's a little gross, but like a fecal implant. They take some of the poop from a human who has a healthy microbiome, and they have found ways to cultivate the critters that are good in that, so you don't have to, like, you're not directly eating that obviously, but there's a way of implanting that good microbiome in the human. So a lot of people are zinc deficient, iron deficient, protein deficient, vitamin A, right? A lot of these things we can access, and if you can grow things garden fresh and all, if the plants are really healthy, if the microorganisms are there in the soil, you can really ramp up your access to, we call it like nutrient dense foods. And I would say, you know, it's one of the reasons why I garden. That's one of the reasons why I mess with it all. Is like to go out there and pick a tomato and eat it right off the vine, to go out there and get cucumbers or zucchini or something. I just feel that that produce is going to be of higher nutritional quality than something I could buy in the supermarket.
Does commercial pesticides reduce the nutrients in our food?
Mm. Yeah, so the modern agrochemicals, fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides, all those things, they kill stuff and they create a soil system that doesn't have typically as much diverse life in it. So even if there's not a direct relationship, they're they're pushing down the life in the soil. And there are compounds that we can get from our foods that the plant doesn't make, but the fungi in its root system makes them. And they're good for us. They're like antioxidants and things that we get that way. So if you have anything that disrupts soil life, it can have an influence on the ultimate nutritional quality of the food. Yeah.
Now, you say lack of zinc and iron. Now, zinc, I've always heard that's good for colds. But
Mhm.
I think I heard you mention before that the lack of iron has caused anemia.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a couple billion humans that are like constantly iron deficient in the world. hmm And so we can get iron from eating grains, and we can get iron from, eating nuts and other sources. We can get zinc from these things as well. But as I said, there's also maybe what the scientists call them is anti-nutrients. There's things that can block our absorption. So diversity of diet is key. I think fresh produce from healthy plants is key, and just in general, growing things in soils that are really soils full of life is going to influence the even the things we don't normally test. Like, have you ever heard of this thing called like phytonutrients and things? It's like phenolic compounds, tannins. They all can influence our health in positive ways. and we haven't really figured out how it all works.
And so I live here in the Motor City.
Hmm.
And so the Motor City is pretty much the car capital of the world.
Hmm.
And if it's the car capital of the world, then you have to have emissions.
Hmm.
You know, it's probably not even a million people in the city of Detroit, but the city of Detroit is so large that you could put the whole state of New York, probably Massachusetts and Delaware inside this
Hmm.
whole state. That's how big it is. The city itself.
Hmm.
And there's lots of car plants around here. And so, because it's the Motor City, everyone has a car. It's not New
Hmm.
York where everybody's, catching the subway or the metro or something like that. We don't get around like that. And so these emissions, what is the emissions doing to our? Does it have an effect on our soil?
Mm. It can. I mean, most people are familiar that at one point they put a lead compound in gasoline, and then they started seeing that when the exhaust would settle, that they would bring down that lead with it, and it started building up to hundreds or thousands of times the natural level of lead, and it can cause behavior issues in children. It can cause loss of IQ, right, in children or mental capacity. So um, we're probably not aware of all the long term consequences that we may face from the period since the Industrial Revolution, really. Um, and a lot of that is because there's been a mentality of like, well, here's just a little bit more, or, the environment can absorb this pollution. But there are places in the world where things build up to a toxic level where plants won't grow. Here in this country, we've got a lot of land that one time, because of mining or whatever, it ended up contaminated with cadmium and lead and other things, and plants will not grow there. I think that the focus from most of the environmental movement on cars is with the CO2, with the carbon emissions. And I'm not as scared about the the carbon issue as many people are. We do have too much carbon in our atmosphere. It is increasing the load of heat. The last 5 years, we've like recorded record heat around the world. I really think that CO2 and other greenhouse gases explain the vast majority of that change, and it has implications on drying out our landscapes, fewer plants, soil that's lost its organic matter, so it can't absorb as much water. So it can be like this runaway negative cycle. But right now, in the soils of this planet and in the foliage, in the vegetation, we have 5 times more carbon at least than what's in the atmosphere. So if we've lost a lot of that carbon out of our soils and we've produced extra carbon by burning fossil fuels, there is the technology to get to balance that is to get that carbon back in the soil. It's to make lots of organic materials, composts and other things can help with this and get that carbon back into the bodies of these microorganisms and back into the plant roots and back into the soil ecosystem. But there are other compounds that are part of modern human life that could be way more dangerous to us, both in terms of heating up the planet and in terms of affecting our health and well-being. And we really have to take a good hard look at how to get these industrial processes that we're so fond of as humans on a different track and see the rest of life on this planet as important and not just there for our profit. I mean, I know it sounds a little preachy of me, but this is what I come back to time and time again. I'm like, we're headed to some really rough times as humans unless we grow up, mature, do something different. see ourselves as the guardians, the custodians, the stewards of the earth, and see the rest of life as partners in that instead of as something to be exploited.
Absolutely. Thank you. Um, I wanted to talk about uh, mercury.
Mm,
How do you, first I was told you plant squash and it removes the mercury out of the soil.
hmm
I don't know how true that is, but like I say, I'm not formally trained. I just listen to what the old timers, we're talking about generations of people who have farmed.
hmm
And this knowledge has been, you learn it at the sitting at the foot sitting at a footstool at an elder, and as they talk and they're teaching. Um, how does mercury even get in the ground? I always associate mercury with being in the water
hmm
and fish, but
hmm
mercury in our soil.
Yeah, mercury and other heavy metals tend to be really good at, we call it bioaccumulating.
Okay.
So let's say you had a really low concentration of mercury, like 1 part per million, right? It's very, very low, very small percentage of mercury. And then you had a bunch of bacteria that were consuming that material that had a little mercury in it. Then what eats the bacteria is eating thousands of them. So it's now 1,000 parts per million in its body. And what eats that is now accumulating thousands of parts per million of mercury. And it just goes up and up and up. And we tend to eat things that eat things that eat things that eat things. So we're really good at accumulating in our bodies these um, heavy metals, cadmium, lead, mercury. So our systems, they can tolerate some. For example, at a certain dosage of lead, your body's pretty good at just storing it in your bones where it's not going to actively affect your cells and whatnot. It just kind of, pushes it like you go to this room over here. But if you eat too much lead, you saturate that system and then you start having more and more issues. So with mercury, I'm not sure all of the sources that you could get, but there's probably some industrial processes, especially from the 50s and 60s, where it was going out into the through the smokestacks and things. Um, you can definitely some of these heavy metals they blow in from somewhere else, like on dust, and then they deposit and build up slowly. And if they start getting into the living systems, like the bacteria or whatever, then they can bioaccumulate, like you said. Plants can be really good at pulling those things out of soil, as you mentioned. But then what do you do with the plant? Do you cut it down and go put it in a dump because now it's full of mercury? What about eating that food? Well, I mentioned a lot of things you can eat a certain amount before you get like a health effect. So tuna is famous for having quite a bit of mercury in it. And a lot of times they say don't eat tuna more than 2 or 3 times a week. And that's because if you're not eating it all the time, then your body is processing it, you're excreting the waste, you're keeping up with the level of mercury in that. But you can have specific situations like where I would say, ooh, it might take us like 50 or 100 years to fix the soil in this area and make it fit to cultivate food in. And we might have to do some extreme stuff like grow a bunch of mushrooms and then remove them and burn them somewhere so that and then store what's left, the ashes, as some kind of toxic waste, right? And one of these places was in Oklahoma. I got to visit when I lived there. It's called Tar Creek, and it's
Okay.
a super fun site. And they did all this mining and have just terrible contamination, the whole watershed. And they've actually been discovering that beavers can be a huge help. because when they build their dams, it trickles the water, mixes it with the air, and some of these heavy metals will actually change chemical form and fall out of the water.
Oh, really?
Right? Yeah. So it's incredible what we could do if we really turned our attention to cleaning up our environment, you know? Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, is that the same for asbestos?
Mm. My understanding is that asbestos is a naturally occurring ore or like mineral, and it's perfectly like inert until until there's some kind of powder from it that you breathe, and that's when it causes issues.
The lungs.
Yeah, so we probably need to dig a bunch of asbestos out of our public buildings and things and bury it somewhere so that it won't turn into dust particles and harm humans. Very expensive process. And, um, I'm not an expert on those kinds of environmental cleanup operations. I just know that life can be our ally in these things, and that holistically as humans, we probably need to quit creating the problems in the first place to start tackling them.
And so I brought up the asbestos for our urban gardeners because a lot of our urban gardeners are gardening on vacant lots where buildings or houses once sat.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see raised beds
Mm-hmm.
to, because the soil isn't that good or they don't trust the soil. And others have just went straight into the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, well, there was a building here. This was the 70s. I know we used a lot of lead paint in the
Mm-hmm.
70s. And there was asbestos. And
Mm-hmm.
stuff is in our soil.
Mm-hmm.
The grass can grow, the trees can grow, the weeds can grow, but will you be planting food and eating the food that grew in that soil is the question. So,
Yeah, I I probably don't need to bring up this term, but when I taught freshmen environmental sciences, I spent a significant amount of time talking about what I would call environmental justice, what is generally called environmental justice. And unfortunately, in the history of this country, the socioeconomics and the racial factors that went into people being in unsafe areas, people being exposed to these things, the wealthier you are and the whiter you are, the less likely you are to have an environment that's unhealthy around you as a kid and, all through your years. And so our priorities are messed up. Our
yeah,
priorities are messed up as we could remediate. We have the knowledge base. There's not the investment in cleaning up these areas. And you mentioned these vacant lots and stuff. I'm so excited to see life coming back into cities and community gardens and community supported agriculture and all that. But there needs to be a lot of resources given to like testing the soil for these contaminants. It's very expensive, testing the foods, all of that. And I really feel that I could point a lot of fingers at agencies that, like the EPA, that need to do a better job with that. And it says everything about how messed up our priorities are.
yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, and before we close out, I think we have about 10 minutes left.
Mhm.
We talked about nutrition, protein, zinc. I want to touch on, you talked about 30% of our soil are unproductive.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a if we look globally at the trends of it, like deforestation, for example, causes a lot of instability. And anywhere that's been deforested, we typically see the soils lose a lot of their capacity for production pretty rapidly. Maybe somebody's cutting down trees and they've got and slash and burn agriculture and they get a few years of growing some corn or something, and then the soil runs out, right? So these big trends, plus most people in the US are aware of the Dust Bowl, right? And how much we lost there from the central Great Plains of the United States when all of the fertile soil became unstable and then blew away, right? So you take all of that into account and you can say, yeah, what historically produced on the land of this planet, at least 30% of it has become much less productive. Maybe there's still a few things growing, but it's not empty, all empty, barren land. Some of it is. Like a lot of planet Earth is turned into wastelands where nothing grows. Um, but what to me is more scary than that is the rate. By some accounts, an area of land around the size of the state of Indiana is eroding away every year globally, right? It's in little slips and slivers on the edges of fields where they meet a stream or something where it's happening, but you know, a rancher is letting their cattle get into the creek, and then they're congregating there, and their hooves are destroying the sod and things around there, and then that is going down the river and out to the ocean. Um, that's just one example. I have a farmer down the way here who I'll watch them till their land three, four, 5 times a year, and I just watch the dust blowing away as they're doing that tillage. That's topsoil. That's organic materials. That's all kinds of. We're losing this at a startling rate. And when we look back at ancient civilizations like Rome and Babylon and stuff, when they started destroying their soils, that was the beginning of the end of their civilization, right? So I think this is an existential threat to us as humans if we continue to let this loss of soil health outpace what we're restoring. Then we're going to find it harder and harder to afford food and to have a stable society.
Absolutely. And so you said 30% globally.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've been to New Zealand. I think was it Zimbabwe?
I've
What's
been to Zambia and
Zambia?
recently to Tanzania, which was amazing. Yeah.
Okay. And what's the soil like over there versus the U.S.? Is it more
Mm,
natural? Is it more closer to um, you know ancient? Let's say ancient man. Like
mm. Um, in rural parts of Africa, I've seen a lot of soil loss and degradation. For example, in Zambia, the government actually subsidized quite a few of the practices and chemicals and things that can cause harm in the long run. And then it's kind of been a problem with agriculture since the beginning that when our populations were low, we could abuse a little bit of land and then just abandon it and move on, right? But now our population's so huge that we can't do that. But even the traditional way of cultivating foods, in many places of the world, those systems are breaking down. Climate change and other things are also having an influence. And then the real problem in rural Africa is the colonial era and their traditional food systems, which a lot of them were kind of forest based or, cattle or, they followed some animals around to hunt or whatever. Um, those systems were subverted and by colonial powers that said, no, we want you to grow cotton and then we'll export it and make fabrics and then send them back to you and charge you more, right? And so the influence of the colonial era on the mentality of exploiting land and then the growth in population, it's there's some real success stories. I got to go to a few farms in Tanzania where I was very excited and impressed with the kind of organic style of production that they were able to achieve. And then there's a lot of places where you're watching um, people have to completely leave, migrate out of an area because it becomes unproductive.
All right, Dr. Cobb, thank you for sharing your insight with us. I really appreciate it. Maybe we'll have you back some other time. Um, you have
I'd love that.
anything? Can you give the people your contact information or anything that you would like to share before we wrap up?
Sure. So the easiest way to get to me, especially if you have a technical question about soils, would be to email the Soil Food Web School. So that's going to be info, at soilfoodweb.com. And our team will forward your email to me from there. So if you have general questions, if you're interested in our courses, we have a new course I contributed a couple of talks to that I'm really excited because it costs $199, which is, and it takes only about 5 or 6 hours of commitment to go through the lectures, but it really provides that grounding in what I've been talking about today with changing, putting on different glasses and seeing soil as a living ecosystem. And so that's called the Soil Food Web Essentials course, and it's always on sale on our website for $199.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right, followers, this is the outro, and you know what I always say. I want you to love each other a little bit more, judge each other a little bit less, be blessed. This is Whitley Farms. We'll take care of you here on the farms. Whitley Farms. I'm out. Thank you, Dr. Cobb.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye.